The administrative state is undoubtedly one of the most anti-American and destructive forces that is embedded within our structure of government at this juncture in time. But very often, the origins of this destructive force elude people. And so I figured it'd be a good idea by going through the principles and the philosophies that underpin the administrative state, which was founded all the way back during the Progressive Era, and explain how those principles are at odds with the original intention of our structure of government in America, and then explain step by step how each of those original principles were negated by this new kind of ideology which brought rise to the administrative state. Before I do that, let me draw forth two separate categories here so we can categorize this for concision and simplicity's sake. Let's categorize the two dominant ideological strains within this saga here as classical liberalism, which was the original kind of old liberalism that our founders clung on to, and new liberalism, the kind of progressive liberalism that was invented during the Progressive Era to justify a broader scope of government, and by virtue of doing that, justify the administrative state's existence. Classical liberalism was indeed the dominant ideology of the founding generation, even if there was variations, obviously. It's obvious to many students of history that the anti-federalists were probably more classically liberal than the federalists were, but still, they were still in the same camp in terms of their overarching values, even if they saw different degrees as to how those values could be manifested, so to speak. And these original values essentially put the purpose of government into one core focus, which was the defense of individual natural rights against excess from both the government and social actors who may not respect them. This was the original intent and vision of the American government. There were more, of course, but this was the overarching goal. And America's entire constitutional structure was so ordered to reflect this ethos in both the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and in also the structure of government. And so this brings rise to the principle of the separation of powers. In the Federalist Papers, the writers, specifically James Madison, were worried about the control, the dangers of a majoritarian faction that might take a hold of government and use it for purposes that are not enumerated in the Constitution, or that might also violate individual rights. And so they devised, Madison and the framers devised this system, this sort of tiered, I call it a tiered internal regulation system of government that would make it very hard, not impossible, but very hard for bad actors or ignorant actors to irrationally or immorally will government power to an end that was fundamentally unconstitutional, and this is called the separation of powers. There were three primary tenets of the separation of powers, which followed from classically liberal premises that were enshrined to our Constitution. The first principle of the separation of powers is the principle of a non-delegation. And it says very simply that one branch of government, the power of one branch, cannot be exercised by the other branches, because otherwise the other branches infringe upon the separation of powers and actually accumulate powers, which is not good. The second principle is the principle of non-combination, which basically says that there can be no combination of functions of other branches within one single branch. Now, Madison quoted Jefferson in Federalist number 47, explaining how he viewed this. And Jefferson is quoted as saying, "The accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny." So Jefferson believed that if one branch were to get too much power, it would become tyrannical, which influenced the creation of separation of powers. So the example would be that those who enforce the law should not be the ones who actually make the law. A separate authority should make the law. This will become important in a few seconds when I explain to you how the administrative state has frankly violated this in almost every single way. It's actually offensive. The third principle of the separation of powers, which constitutes our government, or is meant to inform, is the principle of popular government, that the administrative functions, which are solely meant to be focused in the executive branch, must be accountable to the people via the principle of consent that is exercised through voting. Well, The sort of founders of new liberalism, progressive liberalism, in the early 1900s, culminating eventually in the New Deal, thought that these principles were actually a barrier to their agenda. Indeed, it was the famous John Dewey, who was the architect of modern-day public education in America, that he took from Prussian bureaucrat Wilhelm von Humboldt, whose entire idea of education was to have a centralized force that, in the words of Humboldt, educates for education's sake. He called it Wissenschaft, not for the sake of the growth for the pupil. And Dewey took that principle and said that social consciousness should be the goal of education, not anything else. Different story, different day. But Dewey said that the founding fathers' view of government, the classical liberal view of government, was actually bad because it lacked historical understanding. It lacked historical context. And Woodrow Wilson, who was another architect of the administrative state, is quoted in his essay, The State, as saying, "The government does now whatever experience permits or the times demand." The original classical liberal vision of the government was that it's going to be ruled by popular consent, corrected by these internal functions called separation of powers, and it's going to be based upon these sort of constraining set objective principles of defending individual rights. These were universal goals. These were overarching goals that are transhistorical. They transcend history and apply in all places at all times. The critique of the founding fathers of the progressive liberalism of the administrative state was that these principles don't respond correctly to the challenges of the times, and therefore they should be discarded in order to respond to the challenges of the times. This is an idea called historicity, the idea that history holds this sort of special significance and holds a value in how we should be directing policy as opposed to universal principles. And the founding fathers of the administrative state were 100% on board with this idea. Now, there were several ways in which the founding fathers of the administrative state violated the separation of powers, which will become evident in a moment. Gary Lawson, in his seminal essay, The Rise and Rise of the Administrative State, notes that, for example, in terms of the non-delegation principle, which was the first principle of separation of powers, the Supreme Court quite literally threw that out in 1935 in response to progressive challengers and allowed a whole body of statutes to be enacted to enact the new vision of administrative power. Essentially, what happened is Congress, by statute, signed away its own duties to these unaccountable bodies, and now the duties of Congress were concentrated within literally the executive branch. And we'll get to that in a second. The second principle, the principle of non-combination, happened when, again, through statute and through court rulings, literally all of the different functions of certain branches were coalesced into particular administrative bodies. Lawson gives the example of the Federal Trade Commission, and he says, the commission promulgates substantive rules of conduct. The commission then considers whether to authorize an investigation into whether the commission's rules have been violated. If the commission authorizes an investigation, the investigation is conducted by the commission, which reports its findings to the commission. If the commission thinks that the commission's findings warrant an enforcement action, the commission issues a complaint. The commission's complaint that a commission rule has been violated is then prosecuted by the commission and adjudicated by the commission. In this entire process, the judiciary, the executive, none of it is involved. It all happens internally, which then makes it such as that these agencies become fundamentally unaccountable. And of course, the principle of popular administration is rejected by the fact that through statute, through law, and through court rulings, progressives have managed to make it so that the president has had in certain instances little power over the firing or the appointment of people in certain bureaucracies. So, for example, there is this law that is called the Ethics in Government Act of 1978, and the Supreme Court upheld in 1978 that even though the idea of a prosecutor is an executive office, the president had absolutely no ability to fire that prosecutor. They concluded, and I quote from this essay, that concluding that even an office as obviously executive in nature as a prosecutor could be shielded from presidential control. And the essay goes on to say, these rulings reflect the acceptance of a key tenet of the modern administrative state, that many areas of administration are based upon expertise in neutral principles and must therefore be freed from the influence of politics. I'll close on this. The entire ethos of the administrative state, the entire bluff, is the idea that the independent experts that are not accountable to anyone and who can wield so much power that is not even originally delegated to them in their hands can make the best decisions for government. But in a government that is for the people and by the people, that is based on objective, constitutional, moral, and philosophical principles, that transcends the grasp of a single bureaucrat, we have to ask ourselves, are we really a republic? Are we really a good government if so much power can be exercised by someone who shouldn't even wield that power in the first place? And does it really take an expert, someone who is learned, someone who is well studied, to engineer the best kind of governance? Or does it take people who understand the proper first principles of government and then can faithfully act to execute those principles wherever they may go? The administrative state is a result of the sort of reconstruction, revisionism of a bunch of political reformers who could not accept that the Constitution was a fundamental hedge against the accumulation of power in one branch. And for that reason, through means of legal manipulation and political manipulation and appeal to utilitarianism, these framers twisted our constitutional order, discarded it, and have now put something in the center of our government that was never meant to be there.